Tonight's event will begin with Marshall and Jeannette, our co-artistic directors, who you can see on your screen. They're going to give you an introduction to Handel's Resurrection, what they've been working on, the production that we'll be sharing with you on May 27th is when the film premieres. And then we have, of course, David Fallis with us, our resident music director and conductor. David will speak about the music, of course. And the fourth person on the screen is John Michael Scapin, our wonderful marketing coordinator. There we go. And he'll jump in to chat with you a bit about our gala, I believe, John Michael, is that right? Yeah, that's great. So just to give you some kind of coming soons. Yeah, so I think that's about it. We will run just until 8 o'clock. The very end, there'll be a Q&A session as well. So in the Q&A, just at the bottom of your screen, you can put your questions in there. We have the chat as well. We have a number of staff with us tonight who will be able to answer questions even just within the chat if you want, say hello to people. So we've got a number of people with us to help this go smoothly. But yes, any questions you've got throughout, please put them in the Q&A and we'll make sure that they get answered at the end. There's Holly saying hello to everybody in the chat there. Yeah, and on that note, over to Marshall and Jeannette.
Okay, well, I have a question for joining us. It's great to have you with us. We are working on Resurrection all of the time. Morning to night, it's taking up all of our time in the most wonderful way. We're dreaming about it. We're talking about it. It's a thrilling project for all of us. In fact, just before we started this event, I was at the St. Lawrence Hall. I jumped in a cab to race over to see how some of the scaffolding was fitting in. Gerard Gauci was there. There was a team of people who were putting some of the set together. And we're trying to find ways to sort of use St. Lawrence Hall in an unusual way, treating it as a ballroom rather than a proscenium theater, very much what Handel was dealing with. In fact, I think it's really intriguing that in 1708, when he was creating this work, all of the theaters were closed. He was unable to use the theater, and consequently, he moved into essentially a ballroom for this performance. And we find ourselves doing exactly the same thing, having moved out of our theater into a ballroom and creating an event using the materials that we have on hand. And I think you're going to experience something very exciting and very beautiful. You know, when we're preparing for an opera like Resurrection, we've had a long history with it. Jeannette and I worked on Resurrection with Mark Pynkoski and Les Musiciens du Louvre. How many years ago, Jeannette?
Oh, it was in the 90s.
In the 90s, yeah. Imagine in Halle, at the Halle Festival where Handel was born. And we really fell in love with this piece and always felt we wanted to do it in a fully staged production. We did a production in Toronto, I think in 1999, in the Jane Mallett Theatre, semi-staged, and again, kept thinking at some point we'll come back to it. And it really seemed last year as though it was the perfect time. It was in many ways, except unfortunately, because of the pandemic, as you know, we had to shut down, but it allowed us to pivot and think about this production in terms of a filmed presentation. And this has been a very, very exciting process for us. It's allowed us to look at this not as a band-aid, but looking at a completely different art form. And David's going to be telling you about some of what we went through in terms of recording the music, how our singers and dancers will be performing. It meant Jeannette had to completely rethink the choreography. I've been rethinking the staging so that we're able to work within all of the protocols that are necessary to be able to work safely, but still create a highly theatrical event. And I can honestly say it's been extremely gratifying. Now, we always go to images as our takeoff point, not images that you're going to necessarily see on stage, but painting, sculpture, images that act as a catalyst for what we're creating. Now, when we had first decided to do Resurrection in the Kerner Hall, we thought we would have two enormous blow-ups of pictures, of paintings, as people came up the steps. One of them was the Dead Christ with Angels that you see here. I hope you're seeing it there, by Fiorentino, a really extraordinary work. And what I think is so interesting about this is that ecstatic expression on Christ's face, almost as though the resurrection has already begun, or perhaps the idea that this God man, although he has died, he has not experienced death like other people. And there's the intimation that life is going to return to him. And we were going to bookend that with this beautiful painting by George de Latour of Mary Magdalene. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. An absolute classic. And these are the two major protagonists in Resurrection. Although Christ only appears sort of obliquely, and he certainly has no singing or any lines, but he's there as a presence the entire time, as a life force. And of course, Mary Magdalene, a stupendous role that is being sung by Meg Lindsay, one of our favorite sopranos. And when we were rehearsing this just over a year ago, Meg was pregnant with her first child. We didn't even know it was a secret. And now it's so incredible to have her coming, singing for us and have this beautiful baby. It just seems like a miracle that it's happening and a really ideal thing to be happening now for this production. Now, Resurrection begins with a militant angel that appears at the gates of hell, demanding that they open and saying that they cannot keep someone, something captive any longer. And the angel is accompanied by an entire army of angels who are with her. This was a role that was originally sung by a castrato. And then our big challenge was finding a soprano who could handle the stupendous coloratura that is necessary for this role. And of course, Carla Hutanen, we were so thrilled that we were able to get her from England and come here because her coloratura is so strong and she has such a wonderful presence for us. And I thought this wonderful depiction of the avenging angel was a great takeoff point for Carla and for us. A creature that is androgynous, sort of male, sort of female, but extremely commanding. Now, Carla, in her own inimitable way, the angel has become more and more eccentric. I said the other day, Carla, it's starting to turn into Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a very interesting take. And of course, the angel and Lucifer in Handel's The Resurrection, in many respects, they're the most human characters. And their disagreements and their bickering and angry sort of discussions and repartee, these are things that really add an element of humor to the entire work. Now, Lucifer, the name means the shining one. Lucifer, of course, in a Protestant household like I grew up with, Lucifer was so often depicted as a takeoff point of the great sort of earth god Pan. He was someone who was ugly. He was someone with horns, someone who looked like a goat, something to terrify us. But of course, Lucifer was the most beautiful angel, the most beautiful creation of God. And I think it's so interesting when you do see depictions of Lucifer, when he really is seen as someone who is seductive and beautiful. And certainly Gustave Doré, the great illustrator of the late 19th century, captured this wonderfully in his depictions of Lucifer, as did Alexandre Cabanel, this wonderful image of the fallen angel, who I think looks amazingly like our Lucifer, Douglas, or rather Douglas Williams. It's a real dream cast that we have, but casting Lucifer was a real issue. I think it's one of the most difficult roles to cast, to get the voice that you need, but the charisma and the charm that you need as well. And Douglas really has managed to capture that, I would say, in spades. So we have these wonderful supernatural characters who have their theological discussions and arguments. But meanwhile, back on Earth, we're meeting three people from Earth. One is Mary Magdalene, one is Mary Cleophas, who is a historic character that's mentioned in the scriptures, and the other one is St. John the Evangelist. And this Repentant Magdalene by Canacci, I think, is an extraordinary painting. When Jeannette and I heard that this was going to be on loan to the Frick Museum in New York, we actually flew to New York for a day so that we'd have the opportunity to see it. It's very large, very interesting sort of allegorical painting. And it also became a takeoff point for our depiction of Mary Magdalene in our production. You see that there's a creature there with beautiful wings driving Satan out of the room. And then she's surrounded by those three women. And you wonder, who are they? Are they servants? Are they angels? Are they her conscience? And we've done very much the same. And then, of course, the room scattered with all of the elements that show that she was a wealthy woman, a kept woman, all of the luxury that she is abandoning in her grief. And I'll be very anxious for you to see how we bring those props onto the stage, how they magically appear, and how Megan relates to them. Now, after Mary Magdalene, we have, of course, the bodies of Christ in the tomb. And I think this next image is really very, very intriguing because it shows two very different ideas of what happens with the body of Christ. The Holbein, a very Protestant image, Christ has died, rigor mortis has set in. We're looking at a human being and the focus, the sort of Protestant focus on the humanity of Christ. But of course, in the Catholic Church, which is a tradition that fascinates me because I was so cut off from that as a child, the theatricality, the sensuality of the Catholic Church is something that I found fascinating my entire adult life. And so when we wanted to depict the body of Christ, who appears for just a moment in our production, we thought we had to go the Catholic route and show a body that is like a jewel, a body that looks like it's in a jewel case. And the amount of time that we've spent in France and that we spent in Rome in particular, I'm sure many of you have experienced going into Catholic churches and seeing these crystal sarcophagus in which, or sarcophagi, in which you'll see sometimes the remains of saints, sometimes sculptures of Christ. And again, we were so intrigued with trying to create that on stage and reveal that for a moment during the opera. Gerard Gauci came up with some spectacular ideas for creating this crystal showcase. And I'll be very anxious for you to see it. We have a life-size photograph, the one that you're looking at, of our dancer, Dominic. And it's printed on a piece of glass. It looks so real, you would literally think that Dominic was sleeping inside this crystal case, standing on gorgeous golden legs that actually were originally golden legs from a 19th century grand piano that Gerard had had in his studio ever since I knew him. And he always says, everything is going to be used once for something. And they've ended up being put to use for to great effect in this effect. So moving on, the Catholic imagery in this opera is so literal. And we really felt if we're going to tell this story, we have to be as literal as the text is. Rather than backing away from it, let's embrace the theatricality, the inherent theatricality of what this story is about. And at a certain point, Mary Magdalene and Cleophas start having visions that have to do with the passion of Christ. And they specifically sing about the nails that have been driven into his body, about the crown of thorns, and about a beautiful lacerated face. And so again, talking with Gerard, who was our resident Catholic, he thought, let's really go for this and actually have the dancers carrying these props as though they're floating in the air and the women are having sort of an ecstatic vision. And Jeannette has come up with some gorgeous choreography that really creates that sense that the women are seeing something that they could put their hands through. And of course, the veil of St. Veronica, that piece of material that was supposed to be pressed to Christ's face when he was carrying the cross to Calvary, and that his face was miraculously somehow became imprinted in it. Gerard has created that for us as well. So I think going back to a very literal interpretation of this work has actually allowed us to explore a theatricality, a Catholic sensibility and theatricality that for me is very unique, very new, and certainly for Jeannette as well, and has been absolutely, absolutely fascinating. Now, just in terms of other images, the Pietà by William Bouguereau. You know, when I was young, Bouguereau was just considered beyond the pale. His paintings sold for nothing. the Musée d'Orsay, or wasn't the Orsay at that time, but the museums in France had put all of his work away. It was very difficult even to see any. And when they came up at auctions, they sold for nothing. Now, of course, he has re-entered the canon of the great artists, and well he might, looking at this extraordinary piece. I just thought it was very interesting looking at how he solved the problem that has always been the issue of a Pietà, which is a woman holding a body that is bigger and heavier than her. How do you manage to show that with a sense of elegance and a sense of pathos? And I'm sure many of you have seen Pietàs in which it really has not been successfully resolved. I think Michelangelo resolved it incredibly well by building up the massive amounts of material that the Virgin is wearing so that the Christ can recline in her lap. And I think Bouguereau has solved it in much the same way, but rather than material, she is surrounded by angels. They create a mass that allow her to hold this beautiful body without looking as though she's being overwhelmed by it. What I also liked in particular about this is that body, of course, is an absolute reference to Michelangelo's Pietà. If you flip it, turn it sideways, you can see that Bouguereau is just turning to the great master and is paying him the ultimate compliment by copying that beautiful figure that Michelangelo created when he was such a young man. Moving on to our last image, it's the women at the tomb. And this is actually a moment that happens in the opera that I find very, very exciting because we actually have the women approach the empty tomb and there's an angel that appears to them. But the angel is described as a young man. And yet we have Carla singing it, who is dressed as a woman. So we have Carla singing at the top of a staircase, but then we have Tyler Gledhill, our resident angel, standing on the floor and copying all of her gestures as she sings, as though the voice is coming from him. And it's something I'm very proud of. It's really worked like a dream. And I'll be very anxious for you to see, along with the fact that we're unable to touch each other on stage. We have to maintain distance. It's been sort of like a theater arts class in high school, finding ways to suggest something rather than actually doing something in an overt way. It's a real joy for us to come to this work and to have the privilege of being able to spend time with it now. An amazing cast, an amazing work, a completely unexpected venue, and wonderful solutions to what would have seemed to be problems, but I think have really turned into catalysts for creativity, whether it's the COVID pandemic or the room that we're in, or the fact that people are going to be lip syncing to their own voice. All of these things are actually driving us to find new ways and exciting ways to express ourselves in this extraordinary work. I'm going to hand you over to Jeannette to talk about the choreography.
Oh, Marshall, we have the images from the collage, if you want to talk about them.
Oh, yes, of course, of course. Yes, one of the things that I love about the Catholic Church is their acceptance of human beings, that human beings cannot cut themselves off from their sensual nature. Rather, the Catholic Church, I always felt, so successfully embraced sensuality and thought that's what people are. So let's use that and look at sensuality and sexuality as something that is like an out-of-body experience that becomes a metaphor for the out-of-body experience for spiritual ecstasy. And I've just lined up a number of examples that I think are fantastic. From the top row, from the left, we have Michelangelo's dying slave, whether that's a metaphor, the metaphor for sexual ecstasy, or whether it really is death. Whenever I see that magnificent piece of sculpture standing, I feel as though it should be lying down. An amazing piece and that ecstatic expression. And then right beside it, The Dead Christ by Hegewald. And again, an expression that is so similar in death. One is a liturgical piece, one not particularly a liturgical piece, but looking at ecstasy in much the same way. And finally, on the far right, the Andy Warhol from his infamous film, which is now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, called Blow. And again, that same sense of sensuality. And I keep coming back to the word ecstasy. It's as though all three of those creatures, all three of those people are having a vision. It could be a sensual vision, it could be a spiritual vision, but a vision nevertheless. As we go to the second row, everyone is familiar with the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, a magnificent work by Bernini. In the center, that fantastic 2002 ad for Dior, the perfume called Addict. I remember when I saw that for the first time, I was on my way to the Y. It was a huge billboard, and I felt like something had just punched me. The impact, I thought, was spectacular, and I still think it's spectacular. Very controversial ad, which is always a great thing when you're selling something. And when I looked at that, I at once thought of liturgical pieces that were selling something as well. I just thought there was a real correlation. And then again, another ecstatic image by Bernini. And then finally, in the bottom row, that fantastic image of St. Francis being supported by an angel. And finally, the beautiful Caravaggio. So I just thought all of these, it was an interesting mix of things from the 20th century, from a number of centuries, dealing with sensuality, dealing with spirituality, and seeing how thin the line is between the two. And it's certainly something that we're exploring with our beautiful singers and dancers in this production. Jeannette.
Speaking of beautiful singers and dancers, there's one cast member Marshall hasn't mentioned yet in the singing part of the opera, and that's Colin Ainsworth. And there's a wonderful story that goes with that. Colin was in our semi-stage production at the Jane Mallet Theatre as an extremely young singer. That was in 1999. And the poor young man, just before we opened, lost his voice. He developed laryngitis and was unable to sing anything except for a little bit of recitative. He's come back now to reprise the role of St. John the Evangelist, and he's singing so beautifully.
Incredible.
It's just wonderful for him to be able to come back and actually do this, and it's wonderful for us to have him with us.
Yeah, full circle.
Yeah, full circle, exactly. Angels are something that we've thought about many times. The dancers haven't very often played them yet. We've played spirits and spiritual beings, but not very often actual angels, and that is what we are mostly playing in the resurrection, although there are a couple of moments where we're actually people being led out of purgatory, which is also a very interesting image that we have with dark blindfolds being removed from the eyes. It's very much angels leading people out of the darkness into the light. I hadn't thought very much about militant angels until we did approach this piece, and I looked at images, and the first one was this beautiful piece of sculpture of the Archangel Michael defeating Lucifer. You can see the flaming sword in his hand, and you'll see lots of angels with swords in our production, in our film of the resurrection. Another beautiful image is the Gustave Doré. This is from Milton's Paradise Lost. The angel defeating Lucifer, the fall of the rebel angels. And this is by Gustave Doré. My next image is again by Gustave Doré. This is from Dante's Divine Comedy. The piece is actually called Paradiso. And you're going to be seeing shapes like this from the dancers, patterns like this, circles and patterns like this, very much like this from the dancers. I have two more images. The next one is William Blake. And this is Jacob's Ladder, that famous Old Testament story where the angels go up and down the ladder, bringing messages from people to God and from God to people. And you will certainly see staircases and dancers and angels coming down the staircases in our film. And the last image is another William Blake. It's a group of angels, and you're going to see angels, dancer angels in our film in positions very much like this. except that we're 6 feet apart and more clothed. But I've really been inspired by William Blake in many of my pieces for the choreography.
I should mention as well, it's been so wonderful being in the studio that we're in the hall that we're in. We're able to see some of the camera angles that will be looking down at the stage, at the floor. And I've always felt watching from the balcony was one of the best places you could watch an Opera Atelier production, particularly because of the dancing. You can actually start to appreciate the intricacy of the patterns on stage. And I think we're going to be able to see that in spades when Marcel Canzona, our wonderful young filmmaker, starts filming this and filming the dancing in particular.
Well, that's the end of my images. So now I'm going to introduce our wonderful music director, David Fallis.
Thanks, Jeannette. Well, it's great to be here with everybody this evening, and I will just say that what Marshall and Jeannette have said about what a fantastic piece this is absolutely correct. And it's amazing because he was only 23 when he wrote this extraordinary oratorio. He, as you probably know, he was born in Germany. His father didn't want him to go into music at all. He thought he would make a better lawyer, but his talent could not be disguised. And after graduating from a degree at the University of Halle, he got himself a job in an opera orchestra. He played second violin, and then he played harpsichord, and then he said, you know, I can actually write music too, and he started writing arias, and then he wrote his own first full operas there. And but of course, the place to really learn about opera was in Italy. And so he was invited by one of the Medici princes who had just met him and said, well, if you're ever in Italy, I can find some work for you. So he went to Italy, and he had great success, and he fetched up after a year or two in Rome. Now, Rome was where this, really strictly speaking, the Resurrection is not an opera. It's what we call an oratorio. Oratorios had been sort of created by the Italians in the 16th century, very humble beginnings, really. They were telling sacred stories in music, but they weren't staged. In fact, opera was forbidden in Rome. The Pope didn't think that opera and all of the opera singers and all of the things that go with such a theatrical form should be allowed in his city of Rome, and he did control Rome, of course, at that time. So oratorio filled that niche, especially in Rome, for these wonderfully dramatic stories to be told in music. And as I said, at first it was very humble, just 2 or 3 performers telling one of the Old Testament stories or something. But gradually, by the time Handel came along, oratorios were really a very important part of Roman musical life, especially during Lent, because even then, all across Italy, the opera houses were closed during Lent. And so there were lots of rich aristocrats who loved to pour money into beautiful oratorios. And this is what happened. It was in 1708 on Easter Sunday that La Resurrezione had its first performance. Handel had fetched up with one of the richest men in Rome, Marquis Ruspoli, for whom money was absolutely no object. So there was a huge orchestra put together. They had his biggest rooms, which were on the 2nd floor. The 1st floor up above the street level were always the biggest rooms in these palazzi. And there were given 2 performances. We know that there were 1,500 librettos printed. So there must have been the number of people there was extraordinary. And when I say it wasn't staged, but there was a set, and there were lighting effects, and there was costuming, there were these fantastic orchestra. Corelli, the famous composer and virtuoso, led the orchestra. They brought special oboe players from Venice. There must have been an incredible viola da gamba player who was given a lot of solos in the piece. So the young Handel, 23 years old, just showed off like nobody's business. He knew what an important occasion this was. And then, after the 2 performances in 1708, as far as we know, it was never done again for over 200 years. He never did it again in his lifetime, partly because, of course, he went to England, and Italian works, he did Italian operas there, but the oratorios that he wrote for England were always in English. But as Marshall has suggested, it's extremely dramatic. and especially the way the opera begins. We get the first scene, we see Lucifer come on stage, and he's been up on earth, and he has essentially watched the crucifixion. And he thinks, I have finally had my revenge on God, who kicked me out of heaven for no good reason except that he's a bully, and I should have been equal to God all these many years, and he kicked me out of heaven, and now I have killed his son. And he comes on, and he has this, I'm going to now share a bit of music with you. So I have a way to do this. I will say that you might want to just adjust the volume on your own computer, just depending on how it comes across. But here's just, even without going into the details of the Italian language, you can just hear how dramatic this moment is. In fact, it's what's called an accompanied recitative, which is where the whole orchestra is playing with the recitative, with the absolutely speech-like rhythm of the soloist. And he hears this music, and it sort of echoes, and he thinks, I'm hearing something that I've never heard in hell before. What is it? I guess it's probably people cheering for me as I return to hell triumphant. He doesn't know how wrong he is. But here is, and by the way, just before I begin, Marshall alluded to the fact, this is our recording that I'm going to be playing for you, because we have recorded the music. We were lucky enough, before Kerner Hall shut down about 5 days ago, we were in Kerner just a couple of weeks ago recording the music, because of course when it comes to filming it, we're not going to be allowed to have the singers sing. So they're going to actually be lip syncing, but it's to their voice, of course, and to the full orchestra. So here is Doug Williams doing this magnificent dramatic recitative, just to show you how the devil is being portrayed. My fault. I'm sorry. I wanted to give you the recitative. This is the recitative. Sorry, I'll give you the recitative first.
Quale insolita luce squarcia le vende alla tartaria notte. Qual eco non più dita con armonie granite fa in coro risonnar le stige grotte se son del mio valore gli applausi giusti sono oggi che vincitore cittadini d'abisco a voi il ritorno e già mi vendicai con fiero sdegno di chi perdermi fe e ceri il regno.
So that gives you an idea of this opening scene and how dramatic it is. And you can also hear that Handel had absolutely the best singers available to him to create these kind of effects. The other thing that I find very interesting about this score, of course, the orchestra, which was our wonderful friends at Tafel Music, and they did a wonderful job. They were so thrilled to be able to be playing together on the stage at Kerner Hall. We were all separated, with everyone with their masks and separated, and the singers all behind plexiglass booths and facing away from the orchestra, which was a challenge, I will say, but they really pulled through. In any case, it's a sort of somewhat standard Handel orchestra with strings and oboes and trumpets sometimes. But because this was not done in the opera house, but in this great hall, just like Marshall says, rather something like St. Lawrence Hall, that where we'll be doing the filming. There were these rich Romans had these great, huge rooms where they could entertain and put on parties and so on. And that's where this was done. But they weren't so big that you wouldn't be able to hear instruments at the far end of the room very well. And so Handel took advantage of that to create some moments in the music where it's much more like chamber music. And you'll hear in many moments in the opera solo instruments completely on their own. I'm going to play you the beginning of one of Mary Magdalene's arias. It begins like you would never hear in the opera house, with a solo viola da gamba, this beautiful, soft, elegant instrument. Then comes in a solo violin and they play a little duet. And then they're joined by a most extraordinary combination of two recorders and what's called a muted oboe. Now, oboes don't usually have a mute, which is something that softens and sort of twists the sound. As some of you may know about a mute that you can put in a trumpet, which changes the sound of the trumpet a great deal. For an oboe, when they put a mute on, it's nothing special. They just put some cloth up the end of it, and that's all it is to suddenly become muted. But Handel had this incredible ear for this very strange sound that the two recorders and the muted oboe make, and it's at a very important moment in the opera again, where Mary Magdalene is almost having this vision out of body, and she knows that Christ did not fear to die for her, so therefore she, going forth in life, will have no more fear. No matter what happens to her, because Christ had no fear, she feels that she will never fear again. So here is the opening of this beautiful aria with Megan Lindsay singing Mary Magdalene, of course. So I hope that gives you just a taste of the a range of this piece. And every aria is so different one to the next. This is the other thing that I find extraordinary. Some of the arias are what you can consider sort of standard opera seria, da capos, others not so much. It's very interesting, in many of the operas, there are moments towards the end of a section where the singer is very clearly given a moment for a little bit of show off with a cadenza. But in this piece, there's none of those. There's no moments where you just think, oh, here's a moment, the orchestra will just pause and let the singer show off. I'm not sure whether that was because it was a sacred piece or whether this was just early Handel. It's an interesting question, but it means that the drama is always front and center in the way the arias are constructed. And there's a number of the arias which are not da capos, they just go from the beginning to the end following the text. And so I just sort of stand in awe of this fantastic piece. So people have often asked me, oh, how come we don't know about this piece better? I mean, Handel's other oratorios, I mean, Messiah must be one of the best known pieces in the whole world. Well, I think there's a number of reasons. One, of course, is that it's in Italian, not in English. And the other thing is that the people who really these days do Handel oratorios are choirs. If you think of who puts on the Messiah, it's a choral organization that will sponsor it, or who puts on Israel and Egypt, or even Samson and Saul, because there are wonderful choruses. They hire the orchestra, they hire the soloists, and they put it on. But there are no choruses in this piece because it was just done in this large but not huge room, and there were just the 5 soloists. They do create a little ensemble together on a couple of occasions for the finales. But I think maybe that's one of the reasons, is that you really need an unbelievably virtuoso orchestra, unbelievably 5 virtuoso singers, and then when you have that, you have an incredible experience. So I'm hoping you're all looking forward to that as well. We all can't wait to see how the film works out. And you know, as I said, we've done the recordings. I'm working away with the sound editor every day these days, just polishing so that we have the best audio versions that we can muster. And it's going to be an incredible coming together of all these forms. And it'll be thrilling that so many things allowed to be done on film, which we wouldn't have otherwise really thought of. So at this point, I'll turn it over to John Michael, I believe, is next on our little roster. And I know we'll have time for questions.
Thanks, David. I'm delighted to invite everyone to Opera Atelier's virtual Versailles Gala. OA's first virtual Versailles Gala celebrating our reimagined 35th anniversary season takes place on April 22nd, which is next Thursday night. Our annual Versailles Gala is the single largest fundraising event of the season. Contributions this year will help us to continue to produce beautiful shows safely and to keep all of our artists working. The evening will feature exclusive performances by OA favorites, including Douglas Williams, Opera Atelier's artist-in-residence Misha Brugger-Gossman, and tenor Colin Ainsworth. The evening will be co-hosted by Jennifer Walls, a Toronto-based performer, host, producer, and voice actor, and Colin Asuncion, who some of you might remember as the beloved finalist from season 3 of The Great Canadian Baking Show, which aired on CBC and Netflix. I'm also delighted to let you know that our online auction has launched. As a reminder, you don't have to attend to bid and win, and please be sure to keep checking back regularly as we'll be updating with new items every single day. I do want to draw your attention to one particular item, item number 3, that might be of interest. This was commissioned by Opera Atelier by Toronto artist Paula Arciniega, and it is named after and inspired by Opera Atelier's fall production of Something Rich and Strange. I think this is a terrific opportunity to support a local artist, the Versailles Gala, and take home a piece of Opera Atelier with you. As a reminder, our $100 virtual tickets are still available. I have my colleagues will put some links into the chat so everyone can see, but I will also be sending out a reminder email tomorrow with everyone with a video of tonight's subscriber event and all the pertinent links and information for the gala. This is going to be a terrific evening, and I hope to see everyone there next week. And now I'm going to pass this over to Alex for our question and answer period.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you for that excellent gala introduction, John Michael. So I have not seen yet any questions in the chat, although I know you're going to start to think of them. So please do put those in. I had a question ready though, and I wanted to ask Marshall, how is it that you prepare to create a film? My understanding is you and Gerard work on a storyboard together. Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
Yes, it's a very unusual process for us. Unfortunately, we've already done this working on The Eye and Eye's Delight, that beautiful black and white film we made with Marcel Canzona, as well as the more extended film that we made, something rich and strange. So we've already begun sort of dealing with storyboarding, and it's certainly something that you would never do as a director on stage. Basically, we have to bear in mind how many cameras do we have in the room, and what are the ideal camera angles that we would like to see being explored. So we're certainly not dictating to Marcel exactly what he has to film, but we are saying, here are 3 ideal camera angles that we would like you to work with. And sometimes we'd also be saying, here are some angles we want you to avoid that we don't think would be ideal. So perhaps if a piece of choreography has very elaborate patterns, we're going to encourage him very much so to try to get some bird's eye shots of that. But if there are moments in the choreography that certain individuals start being featured, he has to know who they are and where that's happening as well. So Gerard, essentially, while I'm talking him through the show, he is drawing literally little postage stamp drawings of what the stage is going to look like and where people are moving. And then we write a detailed explanation underneath. So really, it ends up being many, many, many pages for Marcel to be able to study, for his other cameramen to be able to study, and the crew that comes with him. That means that we're going to be able to move through our shoot efficiently and hopefully without any surprises that require us having to reset lights or waste time moving cameramen from one part of the studio to another.
Thanks, Marshall. And now I see we do have questions from our audience. It's great. So from Don Northwood, who's likely down in New York State, is asking, will there be the usual amount of dancing, Jeannette?
Oh, this is a very big dance show. I've had a wonderful time choreographing it. I'm really happy with the choreography, despite the fact we had to rethink because of the distancing. I think it's working. I've got a phenomenal group of dancers. I just love them. And yes, there's lots of dancing. Handel's music lends itself wonderfully to Baroque dance.
And of course, Handel was a huge dance fan. Remember, he was writing music for some of the most famous ballerinas of the 18th century. Marie Salé, wasn't it? Yes. I mean, it's his dance music is some of the greatest dance music of the 18th century.
And Dawn also had a follow-up question to that is, Jeannette, was there dancing in the original production in the Ruspoli Palace in Rome?
That we don't know for sure. Perhaps not, considering it was on Easter Sunday in Rome, but Handel included dancing, as I'm sure you know, in most of his operas, and right from the get-go in Hamburg and other places, he included dances and choruses that were danced. So even though we're not sure there was anything in this one, being a Handel piece, we think that it's appropriate to have dancing in it, and there's certainly good music for dance.
Yeah, there are very overt dance rhythms that are there that would be very, very difficult to ignore. It's certainly not something that we need to stretch toward. The hardest thing is deciding where the dances are going to take place. The music is so utterly, utterly danceable. It plays to choreography beautifully.
Thank you. We have lots of questions coming up. So questions about surtitles on the screen for translation, or will we have the text available? So definitely we have the text available. That will be on our website. And John Michael, is it up there now on our website?
We will be sharing a libretto with everyone. It will be available for download on our website. This will be a very simple document that will be a supplement to our house program book. So it'll be easy for you to follow on in your tablet or on your iPhone, or it'll be very economical for printing. So we will have that, and it will be released a couple days before the premiere.
Yeah. And Marshall, I don't believe we have surtitles on the screen. Am I right?
I don't think so.
Is that the way they were?
Yeah, I'm not absolutely certain if there's a final decision on that, Alex. If we do have them, we were even talking about the potential of being able to have them turned on or turned off. But I don't have a final word on that. That's not something I've been really privy to. I mean, personally, I'm not a big fan of surtitles on the screen. I think they can be distracting. from the action. I would rather be holding a libretto in my hand or following a libretto on my phone if I had one. And I think that would be less distracting, and it would certainly be a more 18th century experience, because of course, when you came into the theater in the 18th century, libretti were always available for everyone who was following the show.
Yeah. Thank you. So we will update our audience on that. We'll find out the information and make sure that we send it out to you in our next communication. We have a question from Maureen McRae for you, David, wondering about the lyrics. Did Handel know Italian? Did he work with a basic script, or did he write it himself?
Well, that's a very good question. He did learn quite a bit of Italian when he went. He seemed to have been pretty good with languages altogether. So whether his Italian was perfect after having only been there for 3 or 4 years, I'm not sure, but he certainly did know Italian quite well. He did not write the script, or what we would call the libretto. It was written by a courtly poet, a man named Capece was his name. He actually was the resident court poet. There was the Queen of Poland was resident in Rome at the time, and he was in her employ. This is the way it worked with all of these artists working, like Handel, for instance. He lived with Ruspoli. Ruspoli basically hired him for a couple of years and said, I'm going to pay you a salary. I'm going to give you a gorgeous room in which to live in my palace, and I expect you to write music for me. And that's what he did. And he wrote cantatas. And this, of course, I think The Resurrection was his grandest piece. And so the poets were often in the same situation. So this was another poet who was employed by a slightly different aristocrat, but they shared around some of their artists. And so he would have been given the libretto, and he set the libretto, which is the way he worked in the opera world when he worked as well.
It certainly is a superb libretto. It's
a very interesting libretto. And you know, Marshall, we were just talking the other day about that recitative when the angel calls the souls out of purgatory.
Yes.
And there's the reference to seeing the stars, that they're going to be able to see the stars. And everyone would have known in this Italian world that that's a reference to Dante, because at the end of the Inferno, Virgil and Aeneas get to see the stars. Dante and Virgil get to see the stars when they leave hell. And the very last line of the whole thing of the Paradiso is about love that moves the sun and the other stars. So that those references to Dante and the pictures of those Dore paintings of Dante were very, very appropriate. But no, it's an excellent and very elegant libretto indeed.
Thank you, David. We have a couple of questions about film. I might roll the two of them together and see if Marshall, maybe you can take these ones on. So Sheila Phillips is asking, do you envision in the future that you could develop pieces for film, as it adds some wonderfully different dimensions to the productions? And Carol Clark is asking, is this a film that, thinking ahead, you might like to show online in Easter 2022, or a hybrid of live and film? So some film in our future, Marshall.
Well, film is going to be part of our future without a question. In fact, our fall production already is an extension of everything that our composer, Edwin Huizinga, has written for us. And so our fall project is called Angel, and it's going to be everything that you have heard Edwin write over the past 3 years, and large excerpts from Milton's Paradise Lost and additional poetry by Rilke. And so a very, very exciting project, which again, Misha will be involved in, but also all of the other singers who have been involved up to this point, and our dancers. So yes, film is going to be part of our lives, and we'll just see sometimes a bigger part, sometimes not as big a part. But this has been a wonderful learning experience, and it's something that we want to be able to continue embracing moving forward.
And as far as the film of Resurrection, I hope it becomes an Easter tradition at some point.
Yeah, it would really be a wonderful thing. Although we are also looking very forward to taking this production of Resurrection and doing it live on stage, which will be another experience entirely. But certainly, this would be a wonderful yearly event.
Wonderful. And we have a couple of lovely comments. So Jan Lambert saying that the choreography that you do, Jeannette, is another way of painting the story in your brilliant hand. So just a nice comment. And
Thank you, Jen.
and Maureen McCrae saying, thank you all for persevering to create this for us, a joy in these times. Something to
We
look
couldn't do it without all of you, so thank you so very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And David, I think we have time for just a couple more things. And David, I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit about, you had mentioned earlier when we were just chatting before everyone joined us that the trumpets are putting in their parts separately. How is that working?
Oh, yes. Well, you know, when we decided, of course, that this was going to be a film, which is so thrilling, and we learned so much with Something Rich and Strange that it's best to pre-record the singers. Well, you have to pre-record the singers. But with Something Rich and Strange, we had a very small group, so it was not that hard to put everyone in the room all together and still keep your distance one from another. But with the size of the orchestra for Handel's Resurrection, and we didn't want to leave instruments out, we realized that we might get too crowded if we had everybody in the room. As you also probably know, everybody, the wind instruments and the brass instruments, anytime, and the singers, anybody, when you're using your breath to make your music, as opposed to the violins who are using their bows and their strings, there's even more restrictions because, of course, with COVID, that's what we have to be so careful about. So we decided, and furthermore, the principal trumpet player is in Montreal. We were going to bring him here, but there was all the issues of bringing someone from Quebec and the whole thing there. So what we were going to do with them was once we've got a final version of the pieces that the trumpets are in, there's only 5 or 6 movements that have trumpets, but those will be sent to those players. They will put on their headphones, listen to the track, and turn on a microphone in front of them and play their part with the track. So they'll be hearing the orchestra all around them, and they'll know how fast it goes and anything like that. They'll listen to it, so they read and do it, and they'll just have their music, but the only sound going into the air, and therefore into the microphone, is their part, and they'll send that to us, and then our sound editor will take their part and layer it in to the rest of the music so that it sounds like they were all in the room together. And this is what we're doing with the trumpets. Nobody else did we have to do that with, but it was just because 2 extra players on stage, especially 2 extra players, which take so much more room on stage because they're wind players or using their brass players. And so that's what we're doing with the trumpet players.
Well, given the extraordinary what is the word I want? Instability of Baroque trumpets. I mean, they must be the most nerve-wracking instrument to have to play.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
It's marvelous to think that we'll have it all under control rather than being on tenterhooks.
It's a high wire act, and it's true. As they put their headphones on, and if they cack the first note, they just start again and do it again.
Do it again. Absolutely.
There are advantages. There are advantages.
Yes.
That's wonderful. Well, we have some nice comments. I'm just going to wrap things up now, but just, Sheila's saying how nice it is to see everyone that these get-togethers are helping us get through the pandemic. And Sheila, we feel you with us as well, so thank you. And Christina says, I'm so looking forward to seeing this production and will welcome it as a harbinger of our societal resurrection after the pandemic. So
I hope so.
Yes. Yes.
That's a lovely comment. So just to wrap it up, I just wanted to thank David Fallis, Jeannette Lajeunesse Zingg, and Marshall Pynkoski, and of course, John Michael Scapin for joining us tonight. And thanks to all of you. So glad you could be here with us. A couple of little things I wanted to make sure that you all knew about the film, a free film that we have on our website right now that you can watch. It'll just give you a bit of a background and about how this team has been able to put together a production during a pandemic. So it's our Making of the Resurrection film, and it's just about half an hour long, really fun to watch. So I recommend that. It's available for free on our website. And just a reminder that our Resurrection will be filmed. The premiere of the film will be on May 27th at 7 p.m. So you will get the link from John Michael in your email, and I believe it's on the day of the show you'll receive that link. John Michael's nodding. I think that's correct. Yeah. Okay. John Michael's also put a link up in the chat to the Making of the Resurrection if you want to grab and click on that before we shut down the event. But anyways, I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Yep. Good night. Thanks to
Good
everybody.
night. Thank you,
See all
everyone.
the names that were here. Wonderful.
See you soon.
Yes.